Hello, this is Bill Bullard with RCAF USA, the voice of the independent cattle producer in the United States of America. Well, the United States International Trade Commission is supposed to complete its report on the likely economic impacts of the newly proposed United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, on the United States economy. And that report was to be completed by mid-March and then delivered both to the President and to Congress so that Congress could later vote on the agreement. However, as a result of the government shutdown, the U.S. International Trade Commission is not likely completing work on the report, and the deadline is likely to be pushed back for we don't know how long. But it's important to go back to the original negotiating objectives that our U.S. Trade Ambassador had when he sat down to renegotiate the old North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Those objectives including reducing the trade deficit between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and strengthening the rules of origin within the agreement, and including effective provisions against currency manipulation, and guarding against third-party market-distorting practices in state-owned enterprises. Now, we fully supported these objectives, but when the agreement was actually negotiated and announced, what we found was none of these objectives were met for the United States' single largest agricultural sector, and that's the United States cattle industry. The USMCA makes no changes to cattle and beef trade. Consequently, we could expect more of the same, more of what we've already suffered under since 1994 when the North American Free Trade Agreement was implemented. So the North American Meat Institute and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, representing packer interests primarily, argued before the U.S. International Trade Commission that we need to continue importing cattle from Mexico and Canada in order to supplement shortages in our herd and help our feed yards and packing facilities run at optimal levels. Now, our position is just the opposite. We believe that importing these undifferentiated, cheaper animals is displacing domestic production. But the North American Meat Institute and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association offered some explanation for their position, and they pointed to the Pacific Northwest. And they said in that Northwest region, we import 227,000 head of Canadian fat cattle a year, representing about 19% of the processing capacity in that region. And then we import another 55,000 Canadian feeder cattle, also in the region, representing about 8% of the one-time packing capacity in the region. And then the National Cattlemen's Beef Association chimed in and said, especially in the Pacific Northwest, imports of Canadian and Mexican cattle have supplemented the shortages in our herd and helped our feed yards and packing facilities run at optimal levels. So RCAF USA took that information and looked specifically at the Pacific Northwest as an example of how NAFTA has impacted the U.S. cattle industry, and we found that in fact our concerns are valid, that we did in fact displace domestic production up in the Pacific Northwest as a result of importing these 282,000 head of undifferentiated cattle. We've lost nearly 34% of all beef cattle operations that were in existence in 1994 just in those three states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. We've lost about 12% of the Pacific Northwest beef cows, which have all disappeared since 1994. And a 2014 Washington State University study found that the decline of the Washington beef cow herd shrank at double the rate of decline of the U.S. cattle herd. Obviously, the importation of 282,000 head of fat cattle and feeder cattle have displaced about 180,000 head of beef cows in the Pacific Northwest and nearly 19,000 cattle farms in the Pacific Northwest. We do not believe that this is good for U.S. agriculture, and we certainly don't believe that it's good for the U.S. cattle industry. And so one last thought or statement by the National Cattlemen's Beef Association was when the commissioners were asking what's the greatest threat affecting the U.S. cattle industry today. And here's the quote from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. The quote is this: "I will tell you the greatest threat that we have in our industry is labor. We can't find enough skilled people to do the things that we need to do. So that's why our average size cow herd has gone down so much." Think about that. With that, we're out of time. We hope you have a productive week. Thank you and goodbye.